Linux Luddites, episode 81, for the 27th of June, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. First off, a warm welcome to all of our EU listeners. However, we're going to leave the politics there because that's not what we're all about. Instead, we have some non-controversial news. It's the end of Android as it's going to be overtaken by Tizen, Snap's the saviour of Linux, and other bits and bobs around there. Then, following that, we have what I think is the most Luddite piece we've ever done. Should you ditch colour and go back to black and white? And at the end of it, we look at Nextcloud. And I know that Paddy's going to string me up for this, but I do have a little thing I want to mention. So I've been talking to you guys off air for the past month or so about the fact that my Drive account has gone over its limit. And I think you're right, Joe. I think I had initiated like my Chromebook or something, and I've got a free lump of storage, and that time has now gone, so it's gone back down. So I was like 11 gig over my allowance, and I looked at what I had, and there was loads and loads of stuff in the photos. So because all my phone gets backed up to there, and I've added more as well. So I thought, well, I'll compress them all because then you get unlimited storage. But before I do that, I'll pull them out at full resolution so that I have them. I've got them backed up somewhere else, but it's always sensible just to, do a backup before you make any major change. And then I compress them. And when you download, you use Google Takeout, and you can select what of the various Google softwares and features you want to take your information back out from. And so I selected the photos. You get this big tarball, and when you open it up, it's got all the folders in there for every day that you've taken photos. There'll be multiple photos in some and one in others. But alongside every single photo is a .json file, which has information about that photo. So it's got all the metadata that Google stores about your photo. And it's fascinating to see. So every single photo has a latitude and longitude, so they know where you've taken it. Obviously, it's got date stamps and the type of camera you've used, so phone mostly in my case. But also, there are snippets of conversations where maybe you've sent it to someone on Hangouts, or the most obvious one is there's a whole chunk of conversation of the whole Google Plus when I posted a screenshot, and it's got sort of Popey and yourself, Joe, and some other of our listeners responding to that picture. So it's just sort of an interesting thing to see firsthand what it is that Google has allocated to every single one of your photos.
I'm surprised that they actually let you see all that stuff, because they must have even more data, really.
Absolutely, I agree. I was surprised to see it in the first place, but then you do sort of think, well, I mean, I haven't dug through every single photo, obviously, but for example, when you type in mountain and it looks through photos for mountains, I'm not sure whether that information is embedded in there or if they've got that all, back at their main server file and what have you. But it was just a bit of a eye-opener and just makes you think about, how do they store this information and how much are they storing?
So does this mean that you can send me your files on Drive again now?
Yes. Yeah, we should be good for uploading again.
Excellent stuff. Right, well, it does say in the doc, tiny intro chat, so I think we should get on with the news.
Okay.
Let's start the news then with the excellent news about Sony agreeing to pay millions of dollars to people who bought PlayStation 3s and then realized they couldn't run Linux on it after a firmware update. And it's really simple to get your money. It's going to be $55. All you have to do is swear under oath that you were running Linux on it and then provide some proof that you were doing so. Not that easy, I don't think.
So when did these come out? I mean, are you likely to have a receipt still?
Well, it depends how organized you are. Some people keep their receipts for years, but I doubt it. Well, unless you've got an email receipt for it in your Gmail or something.
Well, just putting finger in the air numbers, the PS4 has been out for a couple of years, and they tend to get new consoles every 10, 15. So this is probably 12 to 17 years old. If you got one of the first ones, and it was the first ones that had this hole in them, let's say, before they realised that you could put Linux, and they patched it. So you'd have to have had an early PS3. So I doubt many people have got any receipts or anything. But how do you prove that you did have Linux on it?
Well, it came out in 2006. A very quick look at Wikipedia tells me. And how you prove it? Well, I don't know. Did you take any photos of it running Linux? Or I don't know. It seems a very difficult thing to do, doesn't it?
But also, why are they settling this so far after the fact? And it doesn't even seem like a sensible thing to settle. I mean, you're not supposed to be running something else on that console. The whole point of a console is it just does that one thing.
Oh, well, the whole legal argument here was that when it was sold with the ability to run other operating systems. And so one of the uses for it was clustering them and making sort of mini supercomputers, if that makes sense, running Linux. And it was kind of a selling point. I'm not sure about a big selling point, but it was a selling point. And then when they updated the firmware to remove that feature, you almost had no choice but to accept that firmware update, and unless you only wanted to run Linux on it. But if you wanted to do any sort of modern gaming or get online with it, then you had to accept it, and then it took that ability away. So the point of the court case was that they basically took away a feature that it was sold with, and that's why people are getting compensation for that.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. I was going to say Sony are hardly going to pay people who have been hacking things, what have you, but I'm mixing it up with Xboxes and that have had sort of Xbox Media Center and things like this back in the day. So yeah, of course, this makes a lot more sense.
And if you can't prove that you actually had Linux running on it, then you can swear that you had thought that you might at some point and you were aware that you could, and then you can get $9. But the bad news for our UK and other international listeners is this is only in the US, but I think they sold quite a few of them there. So if you're in the US and you bought a PS3, then I don't know, is it worth the hassle for $9? I probably would do it just for the fun of it.
Well, not spending too long in litigation corner. Let's move on. And last show we talked about Nextcloud, the fork from ownCloud, and I mentioned in the intro there that we're going to look at Nextcloud at the end of the show. But it may well have passed you by that they had said they were going to release it sort of middle of July as their first release, and instead they've released 5 weeks early their first version, and so that's why we've had a look at it. And one of the sort of announcements that caught my eye was the fact that they're planning to release all features open source, whereas ownCloud has a number of proprietary and closed apps and additions you can make. So I thought that was quite a good statement to come out with so early.
Yeah, and we'll get into how they've managed to push something out the door quite so quickly later on in the show, although your suspicions are probably going to be realised. But they have actually done something quite useful, haven't they, from a software engineering point of view?
Yeah, the bug bounty program, which sounds like a very good idea to me, where you can get up to $5,000 for finding serious exploits in it, what they call critical, which is gaining remote code execution on the server as an unauthenticated user, down to $250 for fairly low ones. But I think that's it's worth having a go at to improve the software and also make a little bit of money while you're at it.
Yes, this is one of those bug bounty programs where they're just asking anyone that can find an exploit to own up to it, and then they can work their way to close it, rather than one where they maybe say, we've got these known tracked bugs and we'll pay you, $400, $6,000 to close them and work on those. So it's hosted by HackerOne. I think that sort of, the name kind of gives it away a little bit.
Well, let's stay talking about self-hosted cloud platforms for a minute and think about C-File, which is one of these platforms I was quite positive about when we looked at it on show 37. It doesn't really get a vast amount of press. I think that's mainly because it's not a US company. It's actually a product developed by the Chinese and there's a paid hosting service running out of Germany. And I guess it could have been those sort of geopolitical factors that led it to have a recent problem with PayPal.
Yeah, PayPal said you have to monitor all of the files that you're hosting. Otherwise, we're not going to do business with you anymore. And so C-File said, see you later, which is pretty cool of them, I think, to basically risk their entire business model, or not. It seriously inconvenienced them and is continuing to do so, isn't it? Because they've said, look, we're not willing to do that. We're not going to spy on what our users are doing. That's their private files. And we're not going to look at them and tell you what they are.
Yeah, and it also would have been illegal under German and European data protection laws to do that. But you get the impression they would have told PayPal to sting the hook anyway, to be honest. And you're quite right. I mean, they're keeping in business with their hosted solution and giving people free access who had previously signed up. Quite happy at the moment, whilst they scout around looking for another payment provider.
But I mean, PayPal's kind of stance on this is that they were hosting illegal or copyrighted software, not C-File, obviously, but they were hosting on behalf of the people who are using C-File. And it just seems a little bit, like you pointed out there, Paddy, sort of picky, maybe because of where they're from, because people like Dropbox and Drive and that, they host other people's files and no one questions whether or not they've got, copyrighted content and things. So, I mean, PayPal got a lot of negative press over this and actually have backtracked and said, oh no, we've looked at it again and maybe they can use us as a payment service. And C-File have basically said, no, you've shown your true colours and we're going to, even though it's awkward for us, find someone else for the long term.
It does feel a bit like they've cut their nose off to spite their face, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we use PayPal, and I know a lot of people have things against it, but it is the go-to payment platform, and while it has some negative points about it, it's the market leader. It's the dominant force, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. PayPal is just the standard payment system, the name you know, and it looks like we're stuck with it for a while. But let's move on then to Samsung, and they have bought Joyent, which is a company that I'm afraid I hadn't heard of, who are a cloud provider, public and private, which is something up until now Samsung didn't have. They'd just been using Amazon Web Services mostly. And so all of their apps and everything require a cloud backend. And they, instead of trying to make one, have just bought this other company after quite a lot of internal debate by the looks of things. Had either of you two heard of this company, Joyent, then?
I recognise the name, but I wasn't familiar with what they did. But they seem very keen to put a little bit of distance between themselves and Google at the moment and put the pieces in place they need to stand on their own 2 feet.
Yeah, they being Samsung in this term. But so if we look at that and dig a little deeper, we talked on the last show that Samsung were looking at never using Android Wear for any of their smartwatches and instead using Tizen solely on those products. And they've actually gone a little bit further to say that they're going to look at using Tizen across the whole Internet of Things range with the aim of getting it up to speed to actually potentially only use Tizen on their phones as well. And they've said that in the first quarter, the phone sales in India have been very, very strong, and they record 64 million Tizen phones in that quarter. So, there's quite big sales there. But I think you were talking about it on the last show, Joe, that if you take a Tizen phone with the Samsung sort of topping on it, it looks very much like Android, and you could almost not see the difference because they've done it so smoothly with the TouchWiz, is it? Yeah,
the Tizen phone does feel very similar to a low-end Samsung phone. And if they've got all of their apps, their own versions of the apps, then you could probably use it and not really know that you weren't using Android. But then when you want to install something like WhatsApp or whatever, that's when people are going to realize that it's not Android. But maybe Samsung's got the clout to do deals with the likes of WhatsApp and other big applications to get them over on the Tizen platform. But I think it's worth mentioning, you say that they have said they're thinking about this, not officially. This is all kind of unofficial. I don't know. It's a little bit more than speculation, but it's not that much more as far as I'm concerned.
But I mean, it does make sense. And the point you made about them wanting to be more independent from Google, they've always made their S-app this and S-app that. And the fact that people are used to them on Samsung phones, and like you say, it would not be the biggest departure for them to step over and just take all those S apps and drop all the Google ones. It would probably work fairly well. I think they're looking at things like Apple, as a company who has the software is entirely within their domain and the hardware, and so Samsung could try and mimic that sort of setup.
Yeah, but the difference there is that Apple's got the App Store with millions of third-party applications in it, whereas Tizen simply doesn't have that number anywhere near it.
Yeah, I think back to the Amazon phone that came out, and there was that statistic that sort of, 95% of people use the top 20 apps, or there was some numbers like that. And you kind of think, well, yes, it is useful to have a massive app store, and the likes of us and our listeners do go out and find odd applications for sort of slightly niche or nerdy things. And so it's nice to have a really big app store. But if we're talking about the sorts of people who just need a phone and aren't noticing the difference between Android and Tizen, then they're probably not going to notice the fact there's a whole load of apps missing. I mean, you've pointed out some, WhatsApp, for example. You need some of the biggest ones. If you released a phone without Facebook, people would notice. But I wonder how much they would actually need a full-size store.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable point, actually. If you've got the key apps, then maybe that is enough. Maybe, looking back to that list where it was only about 20, maybe that's all you need. You don't need these millions of, fart apps and rubbish like that. Maybe it is just the key ones.
I can't believe the fart app is the only one you can think of off the top of your head.
Well, that's the least useful, just the rubbish, There's obviously loads more like that. Cookie clickers and who knows what. But kind of fuel on the fire of this rumor is the rumor that we reported on last time, that Android could possibly go completely proprietary. And if it does that, then Samsung are not in a great position, are they, being totally dependent on Android? They'd basically just have to take Android as is and use it, rather than being able to integrate all their S apps and their TouchWiz skin and everything. It would make their life much more difficult if Android was proprietary. So I can see why people are starting to, talk about this stuff. But as I said, it is all very speculative at this stage.
Well, in a similar vein, if you like, we've talked about devices running Remix OS, which is a version of Android which is tricked out to have a desktop, on the show in the past. But thought it was probably worth flagging up again the fact that for the first time a major brand seems to be getting on board with them. And that's Acer. And they're punting out a budget laptop with Remix pre-installed instead of Windows 10.
Although that only is in very limited numbers in China as a kind of trial, isn't it? A trial run.
It is. I mean, think back to what we were talking about Tizen a few minutes ago. They are test releasing this in very limited market, as you say. But I think that's exactly how Tizen got itself established. It proved to be a success, and that's now spreading out further around the world. And I guess we could probably view this as an experiment by Acer to see if there's actually mass market out there for a desktop-focused Android device.
I'm not confident for them. I don't have much hope that this is going to do well for them, because Android isn't ready. Even when we looked at the Remix Mini, it just, although the desktop and everything work reasonably well, the apps that you run within it are just too touch-centric to work in a laptop form factor.
Do you know what surprised me is I went home for Father's Day the other day, and my dad's got a Windows 10. Yeah, I think a Windows 10 laptop. And it's got it's a fancy new laptop, and it's got a touchscreen. And you could actually, selecting objects on the normal Windows 10 interface was not as difficult as I thought it would be. If you've got a big list of files and you're trying to pick 3 files, it was sort of more usable than I thought it would have been. Now, I agree that there's a difference between having a interface which has a mouse that you replace the mouse with your finger. As long as you can be accurate enough, it can work. That's the opposite way around to having an interface that is based on having a finger as an input and then swapping that input for a mouse, because it's just not, you're just not that used to sort of swiping whilst holding a mouse and swiping down and things like this. So, and the buttons are just a lot bigger, ready for your big thumb to be smashing around the screen. So, I mean, I don't have anything positive to say about Remix OS, so maybe we should just wish it all the best and let it be.
How's Android N shaping up, Joe? I mean, you've been running it, haven't you?
I've been periodically testing it on my Nexus 9, and I keep trying to make this desktop windowed thing work, and it's just not having it. Because each individual ROM is different. Even though it's based on Android N, it's unique to the device that you're running it on. That's the nature of ARM. and that feature is just not unlockable. I mean, unless someone's got it working on the Nexus 9, do please let me know, because I would love to check it out. But it seems to be only on the Pixel C that you can get this feature running at the moment. And Android N, for me, it's just very slow. I think that's just stock Android. I'm so used to CyanogenMod now. There's nothing really that it offers me that I want to keep running it. So I keep checking it out every time there's a new beta release, and then I immediately flash it back to CyanogenMod.
All right, just dragging it completely off topic then from what we intended to talk about. How does CyanogenMod handle external storage? I'll tell you why I'm asking, because I've got a Motorola Moto E and obviously a decent size SD card, a 32 gig SD card in it to have music and what have you in. And that's just in as extended storage. It's not in as adopted storage. And my daughter's got exactly the same phone, and I set it up with adopted storage. But even then, you're still having to muck around moving apps manually. It doesn't automatically install apps onto the SD card, and it's just a lot of palaver. They don't seem to have sorted out how to deal with expanded storage on Android yet. This is pretty damn stock Android. So I was wondering how CyanogenMod handled it.
Well, the Android devices that I've got that are worth running CyanogenMod are all pretty much Nexus devices, I think. I've got Nexus 4, Nexus 5, I've got the OnePlus One, I've got the Nexus 9, got the Nexus 7, and I tried it out on the old Nexus 7 as well, and none of them have got SD cards. So the short answer is I've no idea, I'm afraid.
I thought there was an app that allowed you to control where things got installed. It's not a Google app, but like a third-party one that you can select which place they get installed to. Or is that what you're talking about, moving them separately?
No, that's within Android. There used to be an app, but they stopped it working in the latest version of Android on the Motorolas anyway. I was just curious because obviously my really grotty old Huawei G300 I used to have, I ran a custom ROM on that actually just totally ignored the internal storage and just treated the SD card as the only available storage, and that was absolutely perfect.
But why would you want to install apps to a slow SD card rather than the internal, much faster NAND storage?
Because if you've run out of internal storage, you're then forever having to clear things out.
But I had a 16 gig OnePlus One, and even with all my music and everything and photos and videos, I was kind of skirting around about 15-ish gigabytes. So I don't understand why you would run out of space on it.
To be honest, a lot of it's the Google junk you don't actually want. I mean, you keep getting updates for things. I mean, I've turned off updates for stuff like Maps and Google Keep and all this sort of nonsense that comes pre-installed that you can't actually get rid of unless you're happy to root it. I was just looking for a simple way around without having to do anything too vicious with it, to be honest.
Well, CyanogenMod and OpenGApps Pico is the solution. That's what I go for these days. So you've got basically just the Play Store. As you know, once you flash CyanogenMod and then OpenGApps Pico and you boot into it, that's all you got. It's just the Play Store. It's the bare minimum to get the Play Store working, and from there you then build up which Google apps you want, whether you want Gmail. I mean, I use Maps all the time, so I'd want that, but I don't have any of that Keep or Newsstand or any of that rubbish. So that's my suggestion to you, is go down that route, and then you've got loads of storage left because you haven't got all this bloat pre-installed. I mean, I think the N beta ROM is over 1 gigabyte, whereas CyanogenMod's about 350 megabytes. What does that tell you? I mean, okay, plus the OpenGApps is another 100 megabytes or something, but it's roughly about half the size, and so it therefore must be using a lot less storage on the phone. Because that is something that it took me a while to understand. I thought that with the Google apps it was all or nothing until I discovered the OpenGApps, which Jesse, you go for like the full blown bloat, don't you?
It's bigger than the Pico, yeah, but it's I think it's sort of generally they call it the one that most phones come with, and it's got Google Plus and Google Photos and things like that. Yeah,
but I'm happy to install them individually, manually.
Yeah, I think the last time I did an install with the OpenGApps, I did go for a smaller one because, like you say, you then realise that you've got Google Magazines and Google Video and odds and sods that you never want.
Yeah,
and I don't think you can uninstall them once you've selected them. So,
well, you can if you use Titanium Backup, because with CyanogenMod, getting root is a case of going into a menu in the developer options and ticking the box, basically. So you can remove them, but why install them to remove them? Why not just go for a blank slate and build it up slowly? I mean, I know, Paddy, with desktop Linux, you are kind of quite a fan of that approach, aren't you?
I am, yes. So I did that with my G300 at one stage as well, but with this one, I was just trying to leave it be if possible, but there doesn't seem to be any way around it other than reflashing it, which is a bit of a shame.
But anyway, we've veered wildly off topic, so we should probably steer the ship back to the news doc. And Startcom launches a new service called Start Encrypt. So this is startssl.com, which offers SSL certificates, and now they're offering a service which looks suspiciously like Let's Encrypt to me.
I think it looks suspiciously like it because it is almost identical. Start SSL is a service we've used in the past because it's free, and it was one of the few free SSL certificate providers. It's only domain verified, much as Let's Encrypt is at the moment.
But what I gathered from this is they've basically made the installer a little bit slicker, a little bit easier, sort of a one-click step you through type thing. Is it actually running on top of the same software as Let's Encrypt, and all they've done is put a fancy top end on it, or are we looking at a new version from a rival or a second alternative?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but it certainly looks to be just an alternative to it, which I see as a good thing, really. It's all well and good to have Let's Encrypt be really popular, but competition is always good, isn't it? And choice is always good. I mean, that's one of the best things about Linux, or possibly the worst, depending on which way you look at it. But to have two easy-to-install SSL certificates seems like a good idea to me.
Yeah, and there are differences, I think, because Let's Encrypt, as far as I remember, is still stuck on the idea of pushing very short-lived certificates, aren't they? I think it's 90 days is their standard.
Yeah, they're 90 days, and these guys are looking at sort of multiple years, aren't they?
Which makes this much more convenient, but there must be a reason why Let's Encrypt have decided on 90 days. Easy to revoke and stuff, but for the end user, yeah, it's just a case of setting up a cron job potentially, but that's one extra step that you don't have to do with Start Encrypt.
But surely the benefit of the 90 days is that you can't forget. I mean, if you set something for 2 years' time, you're going to forget when that happens. And we've seen various websites that have fallen foul of this. And so 90 days is, like you say, I think long enough that you can make sure it works and test it and be happy that everything's smooth, but short enough that you, like you say, have to set up a cron job. And once you've done that, it's there forever, and you never can be tripped up by it getting to its expiration date.
So, Paddy, we are still using Start SSL at the moment, aren't we? And you'd sort of basically decided to move to Let's Encrypt probably when we need to. What do you think now? Are you going to use Start Encrypt?
No, I think it'd be probably reasonable to support Let's Encrypt in their efforts. It seems a far more FOSS-friendly organisation and setup than Start SSL.
Okay, fair enough. But I stand by the idea that you need competition and choice. And even if most people choose Let's Encrypt, it's good to have the other choice available. But Let's Encrypt has passed 5 million certificates, which is quite a lot, I suppose it's fair to say. Although not really in the grand scheme of things, but it's growing steadily, and it seems to be taking over as people's other certificates expire, probably.
Yeah, I do hear commentary on podcasts and stuff and other sort of tech areas where people will be saying, oh, so I just got a Let's Encrypt SSL certificate, and it's becoming a standard that you just do because it's so easy, because it's there, because it's free. And these things take a little while for the cogs to turn and the big ship to move round so that it faces the way that Let's Encrypt has got it all set up. But I think that ship is turning, and as the litmus paper of how the industry works, being tech podcasts and YouTube videos on these sort of subjects, they all seem to be talking about it. And so I think it is something that's just going to get bigger and bigger. And now that they've made it free, more and more services, like you say, are probably going to have to say, well, we'd better be free as well, because we're not going to, we're not competing if we're having to get people to pay for it.
I don't think you used enough metaphors in that last.
I know. Normally I mix them up into one sort of big ship painting, something or other. So at least I kept them separate.
But Let's Encrypt faced a bit of a challenge recently with Komodo trying to steal their trademark, which thankfully didn't last too long. There was a bit of a stink kicked up, and they've now backtracked, Komodo, and are not, at least for now, they're going to let Let's Encrypt carry on. It seemed an extremely spurious claim to me, but thankfully that's all been sorted out.
Well, sticking with security sort of side of things, and oddly enough, we bring up Google in this same sentence. And obviously, we talk about using two-factor authentication, and they're bringing out a new method of two-factor. So currently, if you've got an Android phone and you log into your Google account, it'll send you a text message, and you have to then get that text message and write it back into the computer you're using. And what they're actually setting up now is a push notification that just says, "We've noticed that you're trying to log on. Do you want to allow this, yes or no?" So you've already had to use your password on the computer. You then have a push on your phone that you just press yes, and it pings that information back, and then it logs in. So it's sort of one of the most simple two-factor that I've heard of, because everyone's generally got their phone on them, and they can just push this to your phone and say yes, and there you go.
It does sound incredibly easy, but the problem I have, and the reason that I am not using it, is because I have a plan. I have a mental plan for if I lose my phone while I'm out and about, and that is find a payphone, phone my wife, tell her quickly log into my Google accounts and change all the passwords for me, which that's something that I don't understand. What happens if you lose your phone? Can you actually get into your account still?
Yeah, you just use a second authentication method. So, for example, if my phone is, the battery's dead or what have you, I have a list of preset codes from Google that I can use, that in theory you could use printed out, on a piece of paper and carry that with you. But you can also look them up online, obviously. So you're still on the same PC, you're still on the same browser, but you're having to go to a second site or second source to get that information. Or you could use, the dongles, like I have the little USB dongles. And there's various methods. There's Google Authenticator, which you can look up on your tablet, for example. So this is just another one of maybe half a dozen methods that Google allows you to use.
Yeah, and it works really well, because I set it up, and they're obviously attempting to encourage you to be secure, because it checked and realised I hadn't got a screen lock on and asked me to set one up, and I politely declined, and it still let me do it, I have to say, but it did check in the first place.
So are you saying that I should just get with the program and start using two-factor then?
Are you not?
No.
Sorry.
Yeah, you should.
Mock the afflicted.
I don't know. It just seems like a recipe for getting locked out of my account to me.
No, I mean, I worried about that a little bit. But like I say, these like codes that they give you, you can save them somewhere, or I'm about to say log in some other way. But if you're logging into Google, how do you get the codes
exactly.
back?
Supposing I lost my phone and found myself totally stranded somewhere, or, any PC or any device in the world, I could log into my Google account right now and from there do what I need to do. Whereas if I don't have the codes, if I've only got my password, I've only got that single factor, how do I get into my account if I've set up two-factor? I mean, that is the point of it, is to make it more secure, but you've got this balance between security and convenience, and that's what I'm worried about.
So I've just remembered another one of the methods. I mean, I've listed like half dozen methods. There are genuinely loads of them. Another one is that you can have a phone number that they will call, and an auto voice will speak the code to you. So there's all these ways of getting this code out to you. I have never ever been in a situation that I can't find a code to access my phone or get onto Google or what have you. And I think if you are in that situation, you probably don't have data, so you probably can't log on to Google anyway.
Right. Maybe I should set this up then. Maybe you've sold me on it.
Well, let's move the conversation a bit away from phones and talk about the desktop. And at the GTK Hackfest in Toronto recently, GNOME developers discussed API stability and came up what obviously seems to them to be a cunning plan, but it really just looks like an attempt to formalise their existing practices, which I have to say are quite dismissive of everybody outside of their own immediate needs.
Yeah, they published these articles. GTK 4.0 is not GTK 4 and GTK 5.0 is not GTK 5, essentially saying that with the point releases, it will get to a point where you've got a stable one, and that is the one that will be considered to be GTK 4 and 5. But then all of the other ones are not considered stable. And I think you're right that from the sounds of things, it is just putting a formal framework in place for what they have been doing already, which, I don't know, at least they're being honest about it.
Well, I think it's showing planning that developers can understand where it's going to go rather than find out afterwards. So the problem we've had with GTK 3 is that every single point release of GTK 3 has changed something from before, and so developers have been sticking with GTK 2, fearing if they move to GTK 3, the bedrock on which they've based it will have moved, and they have to keep on updating and keep on iterating just to keep up with this 3.1, 0.2, 0.3, etc., etc. And at least with GTK 4, while it seems unbelievably backwards that 4.0 is not stable, and 4.2, and they do it in 2 dot increments, so I think it's 4.2, 4, 6, 8. And then when they move to 5, the latest one of the 4, so the 4.8, will be considered stable, and you should base things on that. But I think while it's a really weird way of doing it, and it does sound like they're just sort of doing what they're currently doing with 3, but putting a formal framework around it. They've also said they're going to make sure that the GTK releases are every 2 years, so they'll have a known cadence. So you can base it off of whatever the stable version of 3 is now, and then in 2 years' time, 4 will be stable. In 2 years' time, 5 will be stable. So at least you can plan that way. Whereas at the moment, I think it feels like GTK 3 could go on for 3 years of changing, or 2 years of changing, or 5 years of change, and you don't quite know when you should jump. So at least this gives people some sort of foresight as to what they're planning.
So why in the name of all that's holy are they even thinking about GTK 4 and GTK 5? Why as a toolkit, basically, need to change on such a frequent basis, such a large amount of change that it warrants a complete new version number?
Why does a distro need a new version number? Why does anything? Because developers going to develop.
Developers want to get paid, yes, certainly. So I can see, yes, it's in their interest to keep churning out junk no one's particularly interested in, but it's not in my interest as a user. Yeah,
and I guess if you're not interested, then you just need to leave it until it's stable, and whoever makes software that uses this toolkit, they will just have to, they won't have to do so much work to make sure that they're using the stable, and they just wait to know when it's stable and then upgrade as they need. Now, should GTK be doing the constant churn they are? I suppose that's maybe another conversation.
Well, it is. I mean, it's probably not popular opinion, but I think anyone who's developing on GTK is completely bonkers. I mean, Qt is a perfectly good toolkit with a sensible release schedule, perfectly attractive, and there seem to be very responsible people involved in developing it who don't go out of their way to pay off their users and other developers, which is in stark contrast to what the GTK guys do.
Is that why you're using LXQt and KDE then?
No.
Why are you using XFCE then?
Purely from a desktop point of view, I wish it wasn't based on GTK, and in our discussion about black and whiteness we're going to get to shortly, I'll make the point again, because GTK apps and black and white colour displays do not work well together.
And so this is why you are so pro LXQt then, presumably. You think that it's got more chance long-term of stability?
No, I think it's not that at all, because people are going to keep on using GTK no matter how they're treated. I mean, it's a bit like battered wife syndrome, isn't it? You keep going back to them because you think they're going to look after you and they're so important in your lives. But GTK, GNOME, they're not worth it, guys. Walk away. Find a hostel.
Yeah, there's charities out there. Well, speaking of GTK and GNOME and everything then, Fedora 24 has been released, which we are not big Fedora users, I think it's fair to say. But looking at the release notes for this, having not tried it out because I was too busy drowning my sorrows, there's not a huge amount different in here, is there? It seems to be incremental improvements, the newest version of GNOME or a newer version of GNOME and newer versions of things, but no massive changes. There's no Wayland by default yet. There's support for Flatpak, but it's nowhere near ready for default. So it seems to be an incremental, reasonable upgrade to me. There's nothing too exciting about it, but if you're a Fedora user, it sounds like it'd be a nice slight improvement over 23.
And were they on time?
I think they were a little bit behind, but not as behind as they have been before.
Not newsworthily behind. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do still seem to be scratching around a bit, trying to find a reason to exist. I mean, in the olden days, for the longest time, Fedora was ostensibly there to push out and try new technologies, which it did do, but also to put out technologies that they knew damn well no one was going to be adopting long term, just to destabilize other distros and encourage them to include stuff that wasn't ready in their own distributions, so that Red Hat had a clear run at the enterprise market.
Pulse audio?
Yeah, exactly, amongst many other things. And since other distros have kind of stopped following the lead Fedora was offering, they're really struggling, I think, to find a niche for themselves, because they've obviously got a very short support cycle, and the use case for it, I mean, particularly with CentOS now being under the Red Hat umbrella, if you like. So the use case on the desktop for people who use Red Hat at work, I don't know. I'm struggling to see why people use it. I know a lot of people do. Well, no, I know a few vocal people still use Fedora, and there's a big difference there. But I just cannot see the appeal. I never have. I'm pleased it's lost some of the influence it had to disrupt other distros as well.
Well, I can see its appeal to people who like the, Yum, well, now DNF way of doing things. And, they just prefer that, way of doing things, if they are Red Hat people, because CentOS is still a little bit different from Fedora. It's slightly less cutting edge, isn't it?
It is, but there's also Red Hat on the desktop now, isn't there? We talked about a news story a while back where developers could get a free license now.
True. But Fedora's a bit more cutting edge, isn't it? If you want the very newest kernel and that kind of thing, if you've got a brand new laptop, then Fedora is probably more likely to run well on it than CentOS and Red Hat, because that's so stable, isn't it? It's got the slightly older kernel generally.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And maybe in a couple of releases, we may even see Wayland in Fedora 50 or something. Who knows? So we can move on to the sort of the last news item of the fortnight, and this is to do with how we're going to get our software installed on our systems from now on. So Ubuntu snaps, which we've talked about in various news segments, and how you can install them. They're these sort of containerized applications. They've actually, Canonical have made sure that you can now install them on multiple distros. So it's the snapd is the sort of package that you're looking for, and that can now run on Arch and Fedora and, RPM-based distros there. I think Gentoo have come along and made sure that they can run there as well. So this may well be the one package to install everywhere.
If you believe the Canonical press release, then you've got this amazing new way to do things that is just going to work across distros, and developers only have to produce one binary now and it'll just run everywhere. Write once, run everywhere. Isn't that the dream? But there's been quite a lot of criticism of Canonical as a result of their press release, hasn't there? I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I can't really understand why, because press releases are always unbelievably positive and unbelievably buzzy, and okay, maybe they, push the truth of exactly what's working now a little bit beyond the pale, but generally, you've got to be within a certain bound of what's going to happen and what you plan on doing. And Ubuntu and Canonical are very good at doing their press. People on mainstream tech sites are talking about the phones, even though we don't think they should. And so I don't really see where you can be that annoyed at a press release, because they're all rubbish. Press releases are always rubbish. So who cares about this one? I don't understand what the flack is coming from.
Well, I don't think that's a good argument, that all press releases are full of lies and spin, and therefore it's acceptable to keep doing it. surely you should keep criticizing them. We criticized the Canonical press department for saying that the Ubuntu phone and tablet was ready for mainstream use. And again, I think that it's fair to criticize them for saying that Snappy is ready for mainstream use. It's in its infancy. It's an interesting new technology that should be tested, and developers and power users and people who like to test things should be getting in on it. But to say, hey, now it's available for every distro, that's it, it's done and dusted, that's where the criticism is coming from, because it's quite frankly not ready for mainstream use.
Right, so about half an hour before this show, on my Arch laptop, from the AUR, I installed Snapd. I then searched the Snappy packages. I don't have VLC on my box, so I installed the VLC Snap. It runs, it's version 3.0.0, which is like the nightly release from the AUR. Even the main Arch release is only on 2 point something or other. And so I could get that Snap on my Arch box. So it's working. I don't see where that's why I can't see where the criticism is.
I think largely the criticism is because they didn't flag up initially the security aspects and the fact that the idea of containment isn't actually fully implemented yet. Nobody has pointed out that X11 apps are inherently uncontainable anyway. I think we mentioned it on a show a while back. As Matthew Garrett has pointed out, I mean, a lot of this is because Fedora and Red Hat are very unhappy about Canonical having beaten them to the punch here, I think. I mean, the quote that I've seen in so many places was from Michael Catanzaro from Fedora, who says, what's going on is that Canonical beat us to the market in development, and now their marketing folks have beat us in marketing too. And that seems to be the big thing here. I mean, they are attempting to push Flatpaks as an alternative, and it's obviously a different technology. We can talk about it a little bit if you like. But that's equally unready for market if they're claiming that snaps are unready for market. I mean, the security on that side of things isn't in place, so there isn't secure access to things outside of the containerized environment with Flatpaks at the moment either. So you've got two products here, both, as you say, Joe, in their infancy. And it just seems like a huge spat. And the thing that's really kicked off here is that the press has just happily accepted the Canonical press release, put it out unquestioningly, and Red Hat and Fedora seem really unhappy about the fact that their exalted position in the press, because they never used to get any questions whatsoever. Anything Red Hat put out was published quite happily. There's someone else now in that position, and that's what really seems to be rubbing them up the wrong way.
Okay, so maybe my takeaway from the press release is less critical because of the things that I've been interested in. As far as I was concerned, this press release was, you can now install snaps on other distributions. I've just demonstrated that I've done it. As far as I'm concerned, that is tick in the box. Everyone's happy. I'm happy. But you're saying that they're a little bit more peeved about the fact that snaps are being sold with the security and the containerization, and that isn't, while they are contained, they just, there's still some work to be done in that department. And so it's the finer security issues that people are having issues with.
No, I'm suggesting that's what they're arguing, whereas that's not actually their bone of contention. I think they are really miffed that Canonical's press releases are getting taken and not being questioned and just being put out there. I think that's what's really got their backs up. The fact that they used to have this position where they were the only company who were able to put stuff out that was unquestioned and nobody in the media would come back to them and actually do anything critical about them. I mean, if you think about any journalists that are critical or ask difficult questions of Red Hat, I can think of Sam Varghese, and that's the only person who ever stands up to them. And I think they've just realised now that Canonical got themselves in the same position, and that's really annoying them.
Well, one of the other criticisms was that although Snapd is available for several other distributions, the actual Snappy store, the only way of actually installing these things was a proprietary Canonical solution, which it turns out isn't actually that true, because it's basically just a server, an HTTP server that you need in order to install these Snap packages. And Dustin Kirkland has published a blog post explaining how to set your own server up, and it is very straightforward to do that, or certainly relatively straightforward. So I think that criticism is not really justified. But I think there's a bigger question here. And, I wanted to talk to you two about whether you think this approach is actually the right idea. Are they solving a problem that needs to be solved? Because the promise of these containerized new ways of installing applications is that you don't have LTS releases with ancient versions of software. I mean, Critter is a prime example for me. I think I've brought that up before, that I'm on 14.04 on my desktop, and my wife wanted to use Critter, and she checked it out and liked it on Facebook or whatever. And then they said on Facebook that they've got a new version out, and she said, "Oh, can I try that out?" And I said, "Well, no, because we're on 14.04, unless we go through the PPA route." Whereas now Snaps and Flatpak and App Image, they all aim to solve this problem. And so that's the question. Do we think that in theory this is a good idea and that it just needs more work?
So if we come at this assuming that all the promises of containerized apps are true, and we're a year or two down the line and everything's working hunky-dory, So I think it is. I think from 2 points of view. One that you've already made, why should I not be able to get the latest version of whatever software it is I want? I have to wait for the operating system maintainer to decide that they're going to update that package in their repo so that I can get it. Well, okay, some of the ones I might not care if they're 6 months, a year old, but other ones, when a new feature comes out, you do want that new feature and you're willing to run potentially risky, as in beta software, to get it. Maybe you're particularly keen, I'm thinking from my point of view, for photo software, when new stuff comes out, I want it. Or it's not even in your repos. That's the most annoying one. And that's the reason that I think a lot of people use Ubuntu, because you can almost guarantee there's either going to be in the repo or a PPA, or you can get the deb and install it. And if people are making the application developers are making debs that you can download and install. And so whenever I try things, other distributions like Fedora, like OpenSUSE, the reason I stop using them is because I hit a piece of software that I expect to find and it's not there, and I don't find a simple way of getting it installed. Now, assuming that all goes away, from, like you're saying, you no longer have old software because you can get the latest snap or whatever it may well be that wins the war, or wherever you want to put it. From the other point of view, when it comes to someone who's producing a piece of software, they have to make an RPM and a deb and a script and all these various different packaging formats, get it into the AUR, whatever it may be. And there's just like a myriad of ways of doing it. Now, I'm not saying that there should be one particular containerized package system that wins. Maybe Snaps and Flatpaks and App Image, or whatever it may be that becomes the dominant one, or if all three exist. Because what you could do as a software developer is make your software, pick one method by which you want to containerize it. Let's say you do it in Flatpak. You then rely on all the distributions having those 3 or 4 methods of install, and it doesn't matter which one you pick, because as long as Ubuntu accepts snaps and Flatpaks, etc., and as long as Arch does that, and as long as Fedora does that, and boom, 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 your bit of software can be written in one way and it can be installed on everything. And so that just gets this whole problem out from under the developers' feet, and they can start developing for Linux, which is surely like a good end goal.
Well, except that it goes back to that classic XKCD comic, doesn't it? We've got all these different standards. We need a new standard. And then it's like, okay, well, now we've got one more standard to add to the big list. And in this case, it looks like if you are an application developer, you are going to end up having to produce a deb, an RPM, a snap, an app image, a Flatpak, or whatever they're calling that. And it's just adding more work. It's not going to solve the problem for developers. It's just going to give them more to do, isn't it?
No, because you make your Flatpak, let's say, and you do one thing, and the guy or girl who wants to install that on whichever distribution they're on just has to install the Flatpak, D or whatever it may well be, and then you can install it.
Yeah, but that's the dream. But the reality is that apt and DNF are not going away, are they? Debs and RPM are not going away anytime soon. So you're going to end up having both.
Well, no, because you can install a containerized bit of software now alongside, the Debs or whatever it is else that your distribution uses. So you can start it tomorrow and people can start making the back end on the distribution accept these containerized packages. And so, it'll take a while for Debs to die out and RPM and all these sorts of things. But you can start doing this containerization tomorrow. So I don't see why, because Debs are sticking around, you can't also do this. And so I'm back to my point that it's the OS that has to accept these containerized applications, all of them, and then whoever's made one knows it will run on all the distributions.
Yeah, and I guess we've been talking about what's important for developers and also for end users here. And there's another group of people involved in this picture, isn't there?
Maintainers, yeah. People who put the distros together in the first place.
Yeah, and another one of these posts that's been kicked around a lot in the last week or two is one from Carl Keane, who is in that position. And it's an interesting post. I mean, some of his points I think are valid. Some of the ones he makes are complete straw men. But really he's making a case for the fact that maintainers, distro maintainers, are incredibly important in the ecosystem and would be worse off if they weren't there. And I'm not entirely sure that's the case. And I'm just wondering if this is one of these things like Uber's come along and destroyed the taxi industry through disintermediation. If that's not what's happening here with things like snaps and flatpaks and distro maintainers who package up software produced by other people are also going to go the same way. There's going to be disintermediation in this industry as well.
I'm not sure about that one, because I think one of the points that he makes is the whole point of having different distros is that not everyone agrees on the way software should be put together. And if you have this one uniform way to install software and everything is coming straight from upstream, then every distro is essentially going to be the same and there's going to be no point having different distros anymore.
What, so there'll be one Linux distro to rule them all and possibly compete with Windows?
Well, yes, but...
Wouldn't that be a horror show?
Well, yes, because you'd have no choice at that point. And the point that he makes in this article, or one of the many points he makes, is that people don't agree on how software should be put together. And so you pick a distro as a user based on how you think that should be done. And the obvious differences between an Ubuntu LTS and Arch, there's kind of two ends of a spectrum. And there are people who will always gravitate towards Arch and that freshness of software. And there are some people who will go for Ubuntu LTSs like me. And then there's some people in the middle who will go for Fedora or the intermediate releases of Ubuntu that aren't LTS. Whereas if you only had one distro, effectively, then there'd be no choice. You'd just be forced to use whatever upstream wants.
But with the snaps, because they're containered, you can have two different versions of the same piece of software installed, and they have all the different libraries and all the different, dependencies that they require. So you can have the same distribution and the, Arch-minded user having the beta version and the LTS-minded user having the, the long-term support version. And they can quite happily have their way, or you could have both of them and experiment with the beta one, but fall back on the reliable long-term support. So it almost sort of, because the packaging has been taken out of the distribution's hands, you can now select. Now, I installed VLC, as I said, and I went through the mental thought of, well, I could install VLC through Pacman and just see what the difference is between that one and the one that I've installed on Snappy. And I didn't know how I would differentiate the two by the name, because obviously it's just called VLC.
Yeah, if you open a terminal and type VLC, which one opens?
Which one opens, exactly. So I don't know how they're going to solve that. They're clearly going to have to be a bit more clever about naming and things. But the idea that you can have multiple versions of the same application surely makes your point a bit moot, because you can install whichever version you want.
So, okay, we're a couple of years down the line, and either Snaps or Flatpak have won. Probably Snaps based on the PR, but whatever. Even if they are equal, what does a distro maintainer? What is their job? Is it just to pick the colors and the wallpaper?
Well, I mean, there's still, a lot of integration under the hood. We talk about the fact that the LTSs of Ubuntu are more stable than the intermediate releases. And that's just one distribution that we're talking about. So if you then take that sort of view and say, well, Arch is, as an operating system, ignoring all the packages which are installed on top of it, has a fundamentally sort of different set of building blocks that make it. So they will be different. However, I mean, I sort of think, look at Chrome OS. No one really cares what's underneath it because you've got a web browser and you can install some known Google applications. So, perhaps we should have that view of Linux. Like, yeah, you've got a Linux distribution, but as long as you can install all the applications you want on top and they're, free and open source and you're using it for those sorts of reasons, or free or by beer or whatever it may be, does it really matter what's underneath?
Well, for the end user, I suppose not really. And the maintainer will effectively curate the various software that's available and will pick a pre-installed set of applications, including the desktop environment. And so there will still be a need for distros, I suppose. But I don't think we're going to end up with one distro to rule them all, as you think, Paddy, unless you get these distros that have got every possible spin available, every desktop environment. And that's just going to be even more confusing to new users, isn't it?
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting there will be one to rule them all. I was suggesting that might not be a bad outcome. I don't think it's actually going to happen. I mean, we should be in that position already. I mean, so much of the strife in the open source, free and open source world around things like this and the amount of choice there is simply down to a complete and abject failure by the Linux Foundation to either enforce Linux standard base components, or to be too flexible, or to say, okay, this is what Linux is. And they haven't. They could have made this a platform that has succeeded on the desktop. They chose not to. So that's where we are today. And I agree with you. I think Snaps will probably succeed more than Flatpaks because it's a simpler format. It's a more flexible format without having to have all the runtimes, which is another reason I think Red Hat are getting a bit upset, because they obviously would have controlled the runtimes, I think, is how they viewed that going forwards. Whereas with Snaps, it's far more flexible for people to do what they want with. But yeah, the question about maintainers, I do see it very much like a service like Uber. We won't need maintainers, and picking wallpaper and picking default applications, that's not exactly rocket science, is it?
I do wonder, though, the thing that I like about Linux, having had this whole conversation, is having the repositories, because you can do a simple update and all your software updates rather than having to update individual bits or go searching the wild web for, this bit of software for this one particular mouse or graphics card or what have you. And I wonder whether we would end up in the sort of situation that Windows is in, where you have to go hunting for binaries all over the web and you need to sort of, each person just posts their own thing on their own website. And if you're just wildly clicking yes, run, and it's not been maintained by your package maintainers and things like this, whether you're going to be more open to the sort of nefarious software that can be packaged looking like it's what you want. At least you have that sort of security buffer of having distro maintainers who have a repository and they cleanse the software, and there are checks and balances to make sure that it's appropriate. I wonder if, in 2 years' time we'll be saying, you have to search everywhere for these bloody binaries and what have you.
Well, I quite agree. I think that it is very, very important for distros to still exist and maintainers to still exist and repos to still exist. It doesn't really matter whether your package manager is pulling down debs or RPMs or snaps or whatever, as long as it's from a central repository that is curated and maintained by someone who knows what they're doing. And if we do drift into this Windows world of basically downloading a random binary and running it, then we're going to end up in a terrible position like with Windows that is much more susceptible to security issues. And we've worked as a Linux community, I say they pretty much, for the last 20 odd years, 25, I think, to build up this idea of central repositories and maintained software that works well and is secure. And it feels like we're in danger of just throwing all that work out and moving to a Windows way of doing things. The whole point is Linux is different from Windows and better, as far as I'm concerned. So I really hope that we don't go down that route. I mean, you've always got that option now to install, download and install a random deb on Ubuntu and similarly on other distributions. But that isn't the done thing. That isn't the way we do things. That's not the mindset of a Linux user. But there is certainly a risk that if this isn't managed properly, we will end up going that way. And that's what I'm very keen to see avoided. As you probably know by now, if you're a long-term listener, we use Google Docs for our show notes. And at the top of our show notes, we have the bit where we dump stuff, links and funny things. And about a week ago, Paddy posted a link to a post on Pocket Now about turning your devices to black and white because that would somehow make them better. I did it for about an hour and then said, I'm going back to color and will never use this again. Paddy, you said you are still using black and white. I have no idea why anyone would want to do this. It's absolute insanity. So all I can say is over to you, Paddy.
Well, as you say, there was a post on Pocket Now. I think it was more than a week ago, to be honest. And obviously the guy was trying it on his Android phone, and he tried it for a week and then put up a little video reporting what he found. And it intrigued me, so I did it on my phone, and I quite liked it. So then I set my Nexus 7 that way as well. And then my work PC, which is running Windows 10, I found a little application called Negative Screen, which allows you to do that quite straightforwardly. The only system I've got that isn't running like that at the moment is my Linux desktop. And we can come back to why 8-bit graphics on the Linux desktop don't seem to do very well, certainly with my chipset. But I guess the bottom line is I have found myself being more productive and also with my mobile devices spending less time on them. And it's fairly clear to me that there's a lot of distraction with your devices, and it takes a little while to get used to. You can't find things sort of the first day or two you're actually using things like this. And I spoke to you about this, Jesse. It seems that we take a lot of cues from the colours, not just the shapes and the text on our screen and all the little sort of flashing gizmos and what have you. But they are very distracting, and they are very, they suck you in. And rather than actually concentrating on what you're doing, you are so easily distracted and your attention is taken over by them that having them not present because you're actually working in black and white seems to be far preferable to me, at least.
So because you're too weak-willed to not use your phone properly for productive things, you have to put it in black and white so you never want to use it again.
If I can just interject there, I don't think it's a willpower thing. Being distracted is a natural human phenomenon that you can't avoid it. You jump when there's a loud noise. It's not that you choose to be shocked by the noise. You're just I am very easily distracted. If I walk to the kitchen to make a cup of tea, I will come back with the kitchen not having made a cup of tea, but having tidied something, and then be, I wanted a cup of tea, didn't I? And then walk back to the kitchen saying to myself, make a cup of tea, because otherwise I will forget and see something. And so I am, without a shadow of a doubt, the worst person on a phone, because the number of times a day I pick it up, look at it, put it back down, and then think, oh yeah, I wanted to do that thing, and I got distracted by a Google Now post or, some notification or a text message or something or other that's come up. And so I was quite keen to give this a go. And I have to say, the same as you, Joe, it was jarring, obviously, at first. And I think one of the big changes I made was to make my wallpaper much more bland. Now, oddly enough, I made it just so I picked a stock wallpaper that looked fairly monochromatic. And it was only when I wanted to then look at a video later in the day that I switched it back to colour, because I'm young enough to not really having watched much black and white TV. I don't intend on doing it now. And so I put it back, and it was only then that I realised it was a pink background, but I had no idea what colour it was. Anywho, once I'd got over the initial shock, I was actually surprised how, unlike you, Paddy, I must memorize my layout of my phone. And if I'm looking for the YouTube client or app, I know that it's a big red square. If I'm looking for Dropbox, I know it's blue. Of course, you know these things. But I found myself not even looking for what the color was. I know in my head the exact layout of my phone because I use the apps on the screen so religiously that I know where they are. I know what subfolder I've put them in. And, anything that I don't use regularly isn't on my home screens. So I sort of was okay with the lack of color. And I think the thing that surprised me was the number of times that I picked my phone up to do something, and it was only a minute or two into it, or when something was a picture on a post, that I went, oh, it's in black and white. I genuinely got to the point where I, knew where the application I wanted was. There it is. And what I'm thinking is, where's WhatsApp? There it is. Let's read this conversation that we're having. And obviously, a lot of things that you read on your phone is text, and text is black and white is not unusual. And so I would quite happily go without even noticing it. I mean, there are obviously a couple of areas that I hit in this week-long testing period. We were watching the Euros, and I was discussing with a friend the Welsh home and away kits. And so I looked them up to see what colours they were. And obviously that is entirely useless when you've got a black and white phone.
Yeah, as you say, you're too young to remember black and white televisions, because there's a famous clip of a snooker tournament where the commentator says the red's behind the yellow or something like that. For those of you watching in black and white, it's
it's the one behind the pink or something. Yeah.
It does take a bit of getting used to be fair, but I'm not actually noticing now. I get quite a jar when I come home from work and switch on Ubuntu and it's all in colour. I would quite like to get to the position where I can put that into grayscale as well, and I haven't had a success at doing that, to be honest. I've tried a variety of things with my Xorg so if anyone actually knows how to get sensible black and white on a XFCE desktop with an Intel i915 chipset drivers, please let me know, because you stick it in 8-bit mode and it just looks absolutely foul, and it's mainly GTK apps as far as I can see, but that is obviously what my desktop consists of.
It's just occurred to me that we might have some people listening thinking, oh, I'll try this out now. So if you are, it's developer options. So Android phone, just bash the about phone a bunch of times, go into developer options, and right near the bottom, about 8/9 of the way down, there's a thing called simulate color space, and it's on disabled as default, but you choose, monochromacy, one of those.
Yeah, to be clear, you've got to bash build number several times in about phone.
That's it, yeah.
To get developer options.
I'm like a monkey when it comes to putting developer mode on. I just keep on hitting those different tiles until one of them starts counting down.
You are 3 steps away, 2 steps away.
Yeah.
I think in fairness, there are some drawbacks. I mean, obviously watching things like films is a bit odd. It takes you back a bit. And I also noticed outside use of my phone isn't anywhere near as useful. It's far harder to see in bright sunshine than a colour screen. And I suspect it's not actually doing proper grayscale. As you said there, Jesse, it's colour simulation or something. So I think they're just actually masking it with something else to remove the saturation rather than actually doing true grayscale, which would probably be more visible.
But what I don't understand here is I've paid all this money for a phone. I want it to work properly. Why would I cripple it by putting it in black and white? It just makes no sense to me.
But I mean, if the purpose of the phone is to have, clear function, and you're getting distracted by all the things that the phone is trying to distract you with, all these pop-ups and whizzes and colours and things, then actually you're using your phone in a more clear and linear form.
Also, we forgot to mention that you can do it on an iPhone as well, which you wouldn't think would have many listeners from iPhones, but when you look at the stats, it's alarmingly high. So according to the article on Pocket Now, anyway, there are options in iOS to do it. So if you really want to try this, if you want to be a bit strange like Paddy, then you can do it. So we said we wouldn't spend too much time on this. We've spent far too long already. Jesse, any chance you're going to do this long term?
I hope that there would be a way that you could have your main screens black and white, but applications in color like YouTube and things like this. I have to admit, yesterday I switched back to color for something I was doing and then left it that way. And I'm probably going to stick with color.
But Paddy, it looks like you're long term going to actually stick with this then, and you're actually looking to do it on Linux as well, desktop Linux.
Yeah, I've been more than happy with doing it. I find it a lot less distracting than the past and actually more productive.
Well, there you go. But this is from a man who voted out, so, you know.
We said no politics.
All right. Let's move on then. On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thanks to all our monthly supporters. It really helps out and keeps the lights on and all that kind of thing, keeps the servers running.
Yeah, thanks all very much. I think you're down to the contact details bit, aren't you, Joe?
I'm indeed. You say that as if there's something that I've missed.
No, I just look forward to this every month.
Oh, right. Yes, so contact details. You can email us, show@linuxluddites.com. And if you go to the website, you'll find links to the Twitter, which is @LinuxLuddites, or the Google Plus community, or the Facebook community. And you can always, of course, leave a comment on the website. Now, before we get into the proper feedback, a couple of people over the last little while have told me that when listening to the OGG feed on player.fm, which is an Android app, you get this weird crackling. And I spent an awfully long time trying to get to the bottom of it. And then I worked out that because it's a cloud-based podcast player, they basically re-encode our audio. And they do a rubbish job of re-encoding the OGG. So there are two possible solutions. Well, there are a few possible solutions. Either use MP3 and hate freedom, or you can disable the advanced player in the settings, or you could stop using it because it's a terrible app with a terrible layout and it's just terrible all around, and use AntennaPod, which is a nice FOSS podcast player. So if you have had that problem, then there's the explanation for it. I did tweet them and they said they were going to fix it. There was an update. It did not fix it. So don't know what's going on with that, but there you go. There are a few solutions for it. I thought I'd briefly mention that.
Okay, fair enough. And we also were contacted by Libre Learn Lab, and I put this in the feedback, and I read through it to try and understand what it is that they're promoting and that we should try and talk about to make sure that people are interested. And I read it, and I reread it, and I genuinely do not know what it is they are doing. And I realised that what it is it's just jam-packed, this sort of, this blurb that they send out with buzzwords. So if you like any of these phrases or words, then, maybe you should look up Libre Learn Lab and see what they do. So facilitate a dynamic set of workshops, deployments in educational environments, engaging discussions, interactive workshop, push the discussion, technical implementations of opening the education system, a diverse team, collaborative learning, advance the overall goal, concrete value to participants, and collaboration between communities. If those sorts of things sound interesting, go and look at Libre Learn Lab. And Libre Learn Lab, if you're listening, please send through a statement that is obvious as to what you're trying to do.
I note that you skipped over pedagogy there because you can't say that word.
I don't do words so well. And I had to look it up.
Weirdly, I was talking about it about 5 minutes before we got that email. So what's all that about? Very strange.
Very educated man. So let's skip over to the feedback from the listeners. And Paddy brought up in the last show about coding and quality of coding. We got a bunch of feedback about this. So kicking off with Campbell Barton, he said, something that you missed from the coding discussion was making a distinction between different kinds of bugs. I got the impression you were focusing on bugs caused by mistakes in code, and for small single-purpose libraries, I generally agree with your comments. However, things become more complicated for a larger application, where issues are often caused by interactions between moving parts. Many bugs aren't caused by simple mistakes, and may be caused by things like non-standard configurations, bugs in other people's code or libraries, issues with hardware or drivers, functionality which is working as intended but performs poorly in some conditions, and harmless bugs or glitches, you might call them, which don't prevent people from using the software. Now, he says everyone can make mistakes, so it's a bit unfair to point at single developers who make a simple error. If we really want stability, we need teams of people to be responsible for code so they can review each other's work, etc. So I think he's right there. We were sort of focusing on bugs from the coding point of view, but yeah, we should be mindful that these things, a lot of bits of software pull in information from other bits of software or standing on the shoulders of giants and using other libraries and things. So those bugs might come in, but then you could argue that each of those libraries should be well written to not cause problems for the applications that are dependent on them.
Yeah, that's another reason why I get so irate at the constant churn within things like GTK, where it's quite unnecessary. And if there was stability there, they could work the bugs out, and people writing software against it would have a nice stable platform to write against, but they don't. So anyway, Will said, regarding bugs, I'd be curious to know what Paddy thinks of agile development. The word agile has been overused to the point where it doesn't mean much, but it still carries weight with some people. Also, in the current software climate, first mover advantage is important. So many developers emphasize creating a viable product over a polished one.
Before you jump into answering Will's point about agile development, can you just explain what is agile development?
Yeah, I can do so and answer Will at the same time. I had actually written agile as one of the 2 or 3 words which consisted of my notes and my little rant last time round. Agile development means just boshing something together without any planning, fundamentally. People will deny that, but that's the bottom line, really, isn't it? You do it. And one of the other words I had in my little list of words there was sprints. And I also think sprints are a great cause of software weakness, if you like, for the same reason. It's people just doing stuff hurriedly, unplanned, and just boshing it out.
So sprints are where maybe you've got an annual meetup of a group of people, and they go, right, we're going to really push this one thing, and let's all sit down for this 2 afternoons and go for it. And that is likely, because you're in a rushed environment, to lead to problems and bugs. Yeah,
I think in fairness, sprints are slightly less likely because generally the teams of people working, and they do often look over each other's code, as Camel was suggesting a minute ago. But agile development, where it's taken, particularly within the DevOps field, where it's all buzzwords that are basically an excuse for doing things in an unstructured, unplanned, underfunded, overrushed manner. Yeah, it's fine. As Will says, it's fine for getting stuff out the door as a prototype, but so many people are taking it on to actually push product out the door, get the VCs on board, and don't worry about going back and fixing stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just getting old and grumpy.
Well, I think you very much explained to Will your view on agile development, so that's that one ticked off.
Yeah, so Michael said, I work on proprietary software for a particular industry, and it's all much worse than FOSS. We don't do anything unless there's money in it. Reputation and security be damned. We have no standards and minimal QA. It's cash which determines the direction of the software. We use an abandoned compiler and an old database simply because there is no money in refactoring or fixing anything. Developers are not allowed to work on any feature that would cost QA dollars. There is a committee that determines what goes into a sprint, so I can't fix obviously broken stuff, it just has to sit there. We are the leaders in our market segment, so go figure. That is a damning indictment of the proprietary software industry, isn't it? Surely it can't be like that everywhere.
Or maybe this is the problem that we have with the open source community, is that you can see how it's going, and you can see, you can look on GitHub as to how things are being coded, and you can, the very term, you can open the source code and have a look at it and see what's going on. Whereas when it comes to proprietary, you have no idea, and you hope it's being done in a well-regulated and QA'd and some way with standards. But maybe this is a niche case. As the only person writing in about proprietary software there, Michael, I'm not sure we can, say that all proprietary software is done in this way, but you'd certainly hope not anyway. But I mean, to sort of answer that point, Campbell wrote back in again, responding to Michael. He says, more recently, I avoid generalizing about open or closed source software, since open source can range from anything thrown up on GitHub to a line in the Linux kernel, and closed source could be anything from a one-man show to a large company. A while back, I talked at length on the topic with a developer who worked on popular closed source software about best practices and coding standards. He noted that he found the standards much more loose where he worked compared to with his experience. And then the points raised in this conversation seem to vary from open source contributions that have a mixed quality, so you need to be more strict about what kind of code is acceptable. The commit access needs to be earned, not something you're given as soon as you're hired. With a company that hires talented developers, there's the assumption that you know what you're doing, so once you're working for them, there's less scrutiny over your code. And on the individual level, the knowledge that everything you do is public makes some difference too, since it points back to you. There is some professional self-interest not to be associated with horrible code. I suppose that's sort of mimicking the point I was making there about the fact that where it's open source, everyone can see the errors or the good practice, whereas with closed source, it's kind of hidden, isn't it? But I mean, Paddy, what do you make about the point that open source contributions have a mixed quality, so you need to be more strict? Because, we discussed whether or not there's QA and things, and the fact that only really works if you've got a largish company that puts in QA. If the code is doing what it needs to do, maybe the open source side is not so good at actually trying to have a lot of QA because of this known mix of quality.
Yeah, I think we talked about this last time, to be honest. You're right. It's only sort of medium and larger organisations that can afford, apparently, to spend any time on QA. I don't know. I mean, I stick to my guns somewhat that I think self-respect is immensely important here, and it doesn't matter what deadlines you're under. You can choose to write half-decent code, or you can choose to write some rubbish and go home and just forget about your job. People like Campbell, I know from conversations we've had previously, take it incredibly seriously and work really hard to produce good quality stuff. But I look at some of the projects out there I see on GitHub and I just weep, I really do.
Okay, well, moving on briefly, we had a comment on an older episode, episode 77, from Mike F90000, who said, "I'm appalled at Joe's preference for the new digital audio jack. Perhaps some musicians in the RIAA like it, but everyone else knows that it's all about digital rights management, copy protection, and hardware lock-in. Looking at you, Apple." And so I went back and listened to 77, that bit of it anyway, and I said that I love it, or you said I love it, Paddy. We were being sarcastic, but just not very well, it seems, because I can see how you would think I'd be in favour of it listening to that. Well, the bottom line is I'm not in favour of it. I'm very much against it. I think that it's a terrible thing that they're going to do this, take the analog jack out. Even though I don't really use it very much, I generally use Bluetooth, but it's nice to have it there, and I don't want the DRM and everything that comes along with digital-only audio. But that doesn't change the reality that that is how things are moving, and that we are not going to have the analog audio jack going forwards. Probably, well, I'm hesitant to make a proper prediction about it in terms of timeline, but in the next year or two, you're going to start seeing phones at least without it. And when it becomes the standard to not have it, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years, maybe less, but it's going to happen, and I'm against it. So I just thought I'd put that on the record to clear that one up.
I'm sure I saw something on a tech site about an Android phone that's being released by one of these smaller companies, like Huawei's maybe not so small, but Huawei or OnePlus or something. And that's already dropped the headphone jack. Is this something you've seen?
Yeah, I think that was a couple of months ago. It was a fairly minor Chinese manufacturer who had done it. So it has happened. I think, let's be realistic here, it's going to take Apple to do it to make it standard, isn't it? Because as soon as they drop it, Samsung and the others probably will at the same time or shortly afterwards. So it's Apple who, unfortunately, we have to watch on this, I think.
So on iPhones, they've got, is it the Lightning connector?
Yeah.
And so that allows you to charge it and have audio. But do we need to wait for USB-C to come out so that we can have those two things in one connector as well?
No, micro USB supports digital audio in Android now. I'm sure if you spent loads of money on a fancy digital pair of headphones, you could plug it into your existing phone and start using it now.
Oh, okay. I, for some reason, I just have merged the move to make this happen with the move to USB-C on laptops and phones and things, and assumed they're the same thing. But you can already do it with the little micro USBs.
I think that USB Type-C might possibly support more features and more accessories, but the basic concept of pushing audio out in a digital form, that exists already, definitely, in micro USB.
All right. Cheers for clearing that up.
Go on then, let's move it on and talk about a bloated and decaying corpse. And this occasion, it isn't the European Union I'm talking about.
Oh, I was waiting for that.
Florin got in touch and said, splitting up Firefox GUI and everything behind it is just a first necessary step. They first have to get the interprocess communication between GUI and rendering engine right before they can have several instances of rendering engines, JavaScript VMs, and so on. When just splitting the GUI and back end, it can double the RAM usage for some users, so there is clearly some optimization to do.
Have you upgraded to the newer Firefox that has this, Joe?
I don't know. Is the honest answer.
The joy of apt updates, eh?
47. So I don't know. I haven't noticed it. If I have, put it that way.
Well, Will also got in touch about this and said, I've followed the progress on multiprocess Firefox, and the developers do talk about adding more processes in the future. There could be separate processes for add-ons or graphical rendering, and possibly multiple processes for tabs, although likely not one per tab, like Chrome. Mozilla has been working on multiprocess Firefox for at least 5 years, so add-on developers have had time to adapt to it. It's disappointing that something big like NoScript doesn't work completely. The timing is not very good for add-on developers. With Zool deprecation already announced, developers know that they have to port their add-ons to the web extensions format, but the API is not fully featured yet. If I had a complex add-on, and I do have a couple of simple Zool add-ons at the moment, but they were easy to port, I would be hoping to hold out for a way to port straight to web extensions to avoid porting twice.
You would think that if Mozilla was moving from Zool to web extensions, or any sort of move from one API to another, that they would do it in a way that you could just have a simple transition. I mean, I know that it's going to be difficult to do, but requiring the developers to do all of the work does seem a little bit like just having to catch up, and who says they're not going to move to something else?
Well, if they keep doing things like this, they're going to lose more developers, and they've already lost a lot of market share. And just the more we report on Mozilla and Firefox, the less positive I feel about it. And I'm continuing to use it still. I know we've talked about this many times, but every time I think about it, I think that I should move away, but I still haven't. And we'll just have to see if I actually ever do make the change. But that'll do it for the feedback. Let's move on and talk about ownCloud and Nextcloud. Well, we mentioned it in the news, and we mentioned it last episode, and we got a bit of feedback from someone called Mike Tills, who said, on your previous show, Paddy mentioned that you guys have a reputation for being overly negative. I would submit that if you are to be negative about a project like ownCloud, it should be done based on the current release, which is 9.0.2. Negative opinions on previous versions really do not help in the FOSS community, which I think is a perfectly reasonable point. Well, it's a somewhat reasonable point, and we should judge ownCloud on its latest version. And with the release of Nextcloud, which again is 9 point whatever, we thought we'd have a look at both of them. And in conclusion, they're both terrible. So join us in 2 weeks for another Linux Luddites. Right, okay. So, Paddy, I suppose you were the one who, you always get lumbered with the responsibility of installing these things on a server and whatnot. I think the funniest thing is that we ended up with ownCloud, even though you attempted to install Nextcloud, because the link to the installer was wrong.
Yeah, from the Nextcloud page. I don't know if they've fixed it yet. I must admit, I've not had a look since. I did this a few days after they'd announced it, so I thought they'd have updated all the documentation, and they changed all the logos and what have you, but the download link still pointed somewhere totally different, and you had to go and grab the actual download from the main homepage. So as you say, we ended up with ownCloud for a start, which is fair enough because it gave us an opportunity to compare and contrast, really.
There's not much to compare and contrast, is there, really? Not
a vast amount, no. It's like colour difference, logo change.
Yeah, I think I said they changed the blue from Facebook blue to Twitter blue.
Yeah, but Paddy wouldn't have noticed that.
Oh, yeah, that's true, actually. Except presumably you did this on Linux. So
I did, yeah. So I did. But no, I mean, from an installation point of view, not a lot seems to have changed. It's still fairly straightforward. You have to make sure you go around and change all the file permissions afterwards, because out of the box it's not particularly secure, but they do provide instructions on how to do that. But it's no biggie to actually get this up and running.
And so we last looked at 8, didn't we? We looked at 7 in depth, and then 8 we looked at a bit and didn't think it had changed all that much. And I made my usual joke about how it feels like 0.8. So what's changed in 9? I mean, is it fair to say that your general out-of-the-box experience between ownCloud 9 and Nextcloud 9 are, I mean, it's essentially the same bit of software. All they've done is, a find and replace on the branding, change the colors a bit, and pushed it out again.
Yeah, I think we should just harking back to the news story that said it was 5 weeks early. Maybe they had been planning to release something in 5 weeks that had, a more unique feel about it, but perhaps they just went, actually, we've, like you say, Joe, they've changed all the branding, they changed the colors. Let's just push it out and keep the PR kind of going. Fine, but it means that I feel that this review is basically a review of ownCloud 9, which is synonymous with Nextcloud 1, 9, however they want to call it. They're basically the same, to the point where even on the Nextcloud site, they say, if you want a syncing application for your Linux desktop, use the ownCloud one because it works perfectly. But they have gone and at least made an Android version of their application. So there's a Nextcloud app as well. But I think you're right, Joe. We should maybe just use them interchangeably because it's the same bit of software, really.
It is for now, yeah. I mean, the extensions, the apps that you can install on it, that's the only real difference, isn't it? That they have open source. We mentioned it in the news, some of the enterprise stuff. But your basic core functionality appears to be the same. So I don't think that it's going to get confusing because we're talking about both at once, essentially. So the main thing that they've improved over 8 for me is the collaborative editing, which I seem to recall we said was terrible last time because it kept crashing. When the three of us were trying to edit a document together, it would just crash all the time. Whereas now it seems to be perfectly stable, doesn't it? It works for what it does that well.
Yeah, if there's 3 of you, and we can only assume more as well, in one document, and you're writing, it didn't have any major problems. At no point did it crash. We could, highlight things and in bold things. You weren't able to put hyperlinks in, if I remember correctly, but at least it had the whole session that we were sort of, bashing it and adding numbers and titles and bullet points and, just sort of bashing on it, really. It seemed to do that all fairly well. It had a couple of limitations, like I said, with the hyperlinks. We couldn't seem to get pictures embedded into the document, so that was a bit of a problem. But I did quite like something I've not seen before on collaborative sites, where when you were typing on the left-hand side, there was a sort of an imaginary bar, and as you typed on that line, this bar where the line you were typing on would go dark green, and then as time passed, it would fade to a slightly lighter and lighter and lighter until it went back to 0. So as people were typing, you could see with some sort of simple timestamp effectively as to what was typed most recently, which was quite a good feature.
Well, I mean, I was positive about it. You've been pretty positive there, but features-wise, it is incredibly lacking compared to something like Google Docs in Google Drive. It feels years behind in terms of the features. You can't put in links, as you said. You can't put in pictures. It's very basic, almost basically text editor functionality. Maybe that's a bit harsh because you can change fonts to some extent and you can have bold and underline and stuff, but there's no way it's ready for use for our show doc, for example.
No, I'm not sure how useful it would be within a properly collaborative environment either, because one of the tests I did was to obviously set up the syncing side of things and make some changes offline, which would then sync back and then try and edit stuff online on the web client. And if you use any features that it doesn't recognize, it doesn't just ignore that bit of your document, it just fails to actually load it full stop. So if you go and use a font, say, in Abbey Word or LibreOffice that isn't provided on the web side of things, your document won't actually load on the website. And I think it'll display quite happily because it uses obviously a different rendering engine for displaying and editing. And I think that's pretty poor, to be honest.
Yeah, because in something like Drive, you can do that. And if it doesn't have the font, then it'll just guess and put it in Comic Sans or something. So let's talk about syncing, shall we? Let's talk about the core functionality. I've sort of jumped ahead there and gone for some of the advanced stuff that I look for. But in terms of core functionality, it's essentially a syncing solution, isn't it? Now, that's not something I use on any machine, so I don't really know how to compare it. But Paddy, you use Drive and Dropbox, don't you, on the desktop and on your phone? And you do as well, Jesse, to some extent, I think. So how does it compare to the proprietary Evil solutions?
Well, when I sync back to my Linux desktop, I tend to sort of let it do its thing in the background, and I don't bash on it that hard. It worked fairly well. A little pop-up came up that said it is now synchronized, and when you updated something on the web, another pop-up said, so-and-so has been synced. So you could see what was going on there. But I think from some of the conversations we've had off air, I know Paddy put it through its paces somewhat.
Yeah, it's good there are notifications, desktop notifications, because that's the only way you're going to find out if you've got a conflict, as far as I can tell. And I made a point of generating a conflict, an edit conflict. I had a file open on 3 devices, making edit changes all at once. So I got a little pop-up on my desktop saying there's a conflict been detected. Other than that, I wouldn't have known about it because it saves the conflicting file off under a different name in your directory, but it doesn't sync that, or it doesn't appear to sync that anyway, to any of your other devices. So if you're not paying attention and just looking at the web version, and we're talking about a collaborative platform here, so someone else could have been working on that document, you would never know that there was a conflict. I think it really should flag up in the web interface that there is a conflict there, like put a big asterisk next to the file name or something like that, and it simply doesn't. So whilst it keeps the copies of the conflicting bits and bobs, it doesn't really make it very obvious to you that that's actually happened, and I think that's something that could be improved. And
how does something like Dropbox deal with that then?
I'm not really sure in a collaborative environment because I've only ever used it as a personal service, if you like. I'd be interested to know, actually, thinking about it, how Dropbox for Teams or any of these other services that are designed for Teams deal with this, because it's not something I've experienced. I would hope better than ownCloud does. I mean, it's possible they do the same thing, but I would have expected some sort of notification that there was an issue there, so you could actually chase it down and see whether your edits are overwriting important edits from someone else. But I mean, it's good it copes with it, but it'd be nice to have it in your face that something has gone askew.
Yeah, I think that I couldn't really work out why it was you were bashing on it so hard with these 3 different instances, because I did the same thing. So I loaded one up on my computer and was editing it in gedit, and then was also making the changes on the cloud. And where I'd made changes on the web interface, and it took maybe a few seconds to then it does periodically save the changes you're making, and then that would obviously periodically sync. And so when I had gedit open, gedit would say, this has changed on the hard disk, you need to update it. Fine. But when you, like you say, if you make changes at exactly the same time, the one that's on your local PC will save a conflicting file. And I couldn't really work out why this was such a problem, because when I use Drive and Dropbox, like I said, it does its thing in the background quite happily. And I'm only one person. I would only be editing it on my local PC or remotely while out and about. And yeah, you've just clarified it for me there, where you have teams and you have loads of people who are likely to be using one thing, potentially from a Linux distribution and potentially on the cloud or on mobile. That's where you need to be much more careful about where these conflicts are and how they're reported. And so I know on previous shows where we've reviewed ownCloud, there's been quite a lot of negativity about the number of applications they have and the range that they seem to, many different directions that they sort of go in. Should we maybe touch on that with Nextcloud?
I can't really remember which apps we had available last time and which ones are new or were part of the enterprise stuff. But I know we tried a few of them out, like the music player, that seemed to work reasonably well. But looking through the list of the other apps, I wasn't really massively compelled by any of them to try them, I'm afraid. There wasn't anything that sounded that exciting.
Well, you mentioned the music player there, and taking the music player and the photo viewer as sort of two key applications, or sort of sub. They're part of the core package, aren't they? Really, because you've got like the things that come when you first install it, and then you've got all these other add-ons you can make and things. And the music player, I thought, was actually quite well integrated. I thought it was quite nice, the layout on the web anyway, and also the photo viewing was different enough from the document viewer. So I suppose what I'm saying is that I'd expected to go into photos and it basically just list all your photos in the same way that it lists whatever directory you're in, so directory structure or files and things. But actually it's far more of a bespoke application to show you these are all of the pictures in sort of a grid, and you can full screen them and flick through them quite easily. And similarly, there was quite a nice interface with the music application. So I thought they did that quite well, although they still do have this myriad of, like you say, Joe, applications that you're maybe not that interested in.
Yeah, out of the box, both come with the Gallery app, which you're talking about, a Files app, which is fairly self-explanatory, I'd hope, and the Activity app, which supposedly is like some sort of audit trail, but it only deals with things like file sharing and upload. It doesn't actually tell you anything about synchronization failures and stuff like that. But there are a whole bunch of other apps there. There seem to be less, I must admit, than when we last looked at ownCloud 8. Whether that's because they're, again, forever changing the API and people are waiting to catch up, or whether there's just a small sanctioned number of apps available from within ownCloud and Nextcloud themselves. Well, I don't know, to be honest.
But we looked at the calendar app, didn't we? And that had some foibles that took us some time to work out.
Yeah, I added an event to the calendar and then it disappeared. And then it took Paddy to point out to me that you have to click on the left-hand side to kind of enable your calendar that you've just added stuff to.
Yeah, out of the box, it assumes you're using something called the default calendar, and it happily adds entries into that. But the very first time you use the calendar application, it doesn't actually bother enabling the default calendar for you. You have to manually do that. It's little paper cuts like that, which I think we all noticed all over the place. And in that way, it's fairly similar to last time we looked at it, in that most of it works most of the time. But a little bit of QA really wouldn't go amiss, I don't think.
And you're supposed to be able to set email reminders for events, and that didn't work either, did it?
It didn't, no. And similarly with the Notes application, you start that up and there's a little link on the left-hand side to add a new note, and you click on it and...
nothing happens.
Yeah, nothing happens. I thought it was just me initially. I tried in Chrome, I tried Firefox. In fact, I did that for... all of my testing with this, because there were some real oddities around the place, and I wondered if it was the browser, but no, it's just shipped with oddities.
Well, looking down my notes, one of the oddities that I noticed is that on the app, so I think I mentioned that they don't have their own Linux syncing client, but they do have an Android app, and it's very much the ownCloud app rebranded, as we've been discussing. But when you're on the sort of on the browser, so you can look at where your various files and things are, there's a big blue plus button, the standard material design sort of thing. And so I thought, I'll make a document and then see how it syncs up. And you press that and you can sort of, I think, make a folder. You can upload items from your phone, and you can add other apps or maybe move to another app. But you can't make a document or make anything. And it just seemed a bit, well, odd, as you know, to take Paddy's point. But I think there's sort of a discontinuity between the way that you make things and access things and how they pop up, depending on, whether they're docs or text files and things, isn't there?
Yeah, there certainly seems to be. I think the integration's got better on the web client than last time I used it. I mean, things like PDFs and movies seem to display quite happily and look fairly well integrated within the product. I mean, I think at the end of the day, this is really something that's built from a whole bunch of different and disparate open source projects that have sort of bolted together. And in some places, that's very obvious. I mean, when you're opening a text file, say, on the web client, it pops up in a little modal window in front of you. You click on a file to try and open a document, and that gives you a view not in a modal window. And to actually open the document for editing, you have to click on the little menu thing that's further along on the line. And it's just little oddities that it doesn't seem a consistent user interface, a consistent user experience. And I say I'm just putting that down to the fact it's built from a whole bunch of other projects that are bolted together.
So as a whole, kind of an overview here, how do we feel about it? Do we feel that 0.9 would be a more appropriate version number for it? I mean, I mentioned that we've said that before, or I've said it before, because that kind of really does feel right to me. That the fact that this is version 9 implies that it is a mature product, doesn't it? Whereas it does have some pretty bad foibles. I mean, it is much improved, I think, certainly with the collaborative editing, which is the main thing that I use these things for. But it doesn't feel like 9 is a justifiable version number for it.
No, and you talk about the collaborative editing there. I ran up Etherpad just to see where that was today, and that is so much further along and would seem to offer a better solution if you're looking for that. I guess the selling point for ownCloud is it has all these bells and whistles and the kitchen sink, and it's a one-stop shop for things. And I can see that they're trying to become like WordPresses, if you like, for the content management market, sort of a ubiquitous thing that has plugins from everybody, the world and his wife, and can just be a one-stop shop for you. But as you suggest, some of the basics still aren't quite polished out. I mean, they're definitely better than when we looked at it in version 7, and slightly better than when we looked at version 8. So, yeah, I guess maybe by the next time out, all the basics will be working perfectly out of the box and they can think about expanding their empire. But I'm really worried that they won't do that because they've obviously got this hookup now with Spreed, and rather than concentrating on adding polish to what they've got, they're going to be trying to bolt on a video conferencing system.
I think I said it was an essential video conferencing system, so maybe I'll have to stand by my word from the previous show.
Well, I mean, I am reasonably excited about that. I mean, I suppose I'm not excited enough to have tried Spreed, but once it's into ownCloud, maybe that could be a good solution for us. I mean, especially if it's got audio only, which is what we're mostly interested in for doing this podcast, because it's not a secret, is it, that we use Skype for this, because Skype is the best way to communicate with audio over the internet. It's better than the open source alternatives as far as we're concerned. And maybe as part of ownCloud, it will see more development and more people will be likely to try it. And maybe that could become the standard, at least in the open source community, because at the moment it seems Hangouts are the standard, which is inexplicable to me because Google are no less evil than Microsoft and it's technically inferior to Skype. So I don't understand why everyone's embraced it, but it may be as part of ownCloud, people could embrace Spreed and we could end up with something that is actually worth using. You know, it takes being put into a big thing like ownCloud or, well, Nextcloud now, I'll have to get used to saying that, to bring it to the masses, you know, the masses of this very small pond that we call open source. But let's not take away from all of the work that has gone into this. It is perhaps a bit of a bolting together of various open source projects, but as a whole, I think that it is good at what it does. There's obviously room for improvement here, and if they shifted the decimal point in the version release number, then we'd be more accurate as to where we are. But I am excited to see what they do with it with Nextcloud 10 or whatever the next version is, because they clearly have got some ideas, and this version was basically produced while they were working for ownCloud, which we know there were serious problems there, otherwise we wouldn't have Nextcloud. So I think that it's good to have caught up with where we are now. And I'm very, very interested to see what happens going forward with Nextcloud and indeed ownCloud, whether or not they're going to keep pushing out versions and how these two are going to diverge. So it's definitely one to watch. I definitely want to try this video conferencing when that becomes part of it. And I think from now on we'll be slightly less negative about the project. But with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks with more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, Europe.
Oh, no. No. See you later.